I never imagined a simple conversation could unravel everything I thought I had. It started with a fight I couldn't ignore anymore, the kind that had been simmering under the surface for months, maybe years. I had finally stood up in front of her, my wife, and said the words that had been burning inside me. "You can't treat our son like this. Not again." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd felt before, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the verdict I already feared. I could see the disbelief in her eyes, the way her jaw tightened, the coldness spreading across her face. And then it happened. She turned away from me, like she'd been planning this departure all along, and she walked out. The door slammed behind her, reverberating through the walls and through me. My son's wide eyes followed her, searching mine for comfort, and I felt utterly powerless, frozen in a space that used to feel like home. Every memory of laughter, every plan we'd made suddenly felt like a cruel joke. I wanted to call her back, to explain, to beg her to see reason, but the words stuck in my throat, and all that came out was silence. I could hear her heels fade down the hallway, a steady reminder that this wasn't a fight that could be solved with words. The room felt smaller, suffocating, and I collapsed onto the couch, gripping my son's tiny hand, as if holding on could somehow anchor us in the chaos. In that moment, everything shifted. Our family, our life, my sense of self. I realized, with a pit in my stomach, that nothing would ever be the same. The trust I had taken for granted was gone, replaced with an emptiness that pressed on my chest. And yet, amidst the shock and betrayal, a strange clarity emerged. This was the beginning, the moment where I either crumbled entirely or somehow found a way to fight back. Not just for me, but for the boy who looked up at me with eyes full of confusion and fear. My heart ached, not just with loss, but with the weight of what I now had to face alone. The storm had arrived, and there was no turning back. Sitting alone in the quiet of our empty living room, I finally let myself think, really think, about everything that had led to this moment. The years of quiet betrayals flashed before me, each small cut and insult that had been dismissed or ignored, each favor given to her family while my efforts went unnoticed. I remembered the countless times I had stayed late at work to provide for us, only to be met with indifference or subtle judgment when I came home. I recalled birthdays and holidays that had been celebrated for her relatives, while my own contributions were brushed aside as expected or insignificant. The favors I had extended, the sacrifices I had made, the times I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. All of it seemed to evaporate into nothingness the moment she decided to leave. I could see, almost vividly, her parents' smirks when I was slighted, the way my concerns about our son were minimized, the constant gnawing feeling that no matter how much I tried, I would always be on the outside looking in. Flashbacks of conversations where my words were twisted or ignored, replayed relentlessly in my mind. The resentment I had buried deep inside began to rise, bitter and unrelenting. Every overlooked effort, every instance of favoritism toward her family, fed a growing fire I could no longer ignore. It wasn't just hurt anymore. It was rage mixed with profound sadness, the kind that gnaws at your chest and makes it impossible to forget. And in that anger, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. For too long, I had been invisible, disregarded, and dismissed. And now, finally, the full weight of that neglect was crushing me. Every memory, every slight, every sacrifice converged into a single, undeniable thought: I couldn't let this go. Not anymore. The next morning, I thought I could face the world, at least for my son's sake, but I was naive. Walking into his school felt like stepping onto a stage where I had no script, no lines, only the fear of judgment hanging heavy in the air. I saw her there before I even reached the office, standing with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her arm linked with her sister as if nothing had changed. I tried to approach calmly to talk about our son, but the moment I opened my mouth, she cut me off with a sharp, loud accusation that echoed through the small lobby. "Maybe if you actually cared about him, you wouldn't have ruined everything." She spat, her words dripping with contempt. Heads turned. Teachers, parents, even the receptionist stared, some in shock, some in awkward silence. My stomach dropped, every eye on me amplifying the humiliation, and my son tugged at my hand, sensing the tension and confusion. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, but the words faltered, trapped in my throat, leaving me exposed and impotent. She continued, recounting exaggerated grievances to anyone who would listen, painting me as selfish, reckless, and unfit, all in front of the very people who were supposed to support me. My face burned, my pride shredded, and I felt the weight of their gazes, judgmental and unforgiving. In that moment, I wasn't just a husband or a father. I was a spectacle, a cautionary tale, and every humiliation was magnified. All I could do was hold my son close, whisper that everything would be okay, even as I doubted it myself, feeling the sting of public rejection sink deep into my chest. That day, I realized that the battle wasn't just at home anymore. The world seemed to side with her, and I was left isolated in plain view, grappling with shame that cut sharper than any private betrayal. The days that followed blurred into one long ache. I remember sitting in the quiet of my half-empty living room, the echo of her absence louder than any argument we'd ever had. Bills piled on the counter like small reminders of everything slipping through my fingers, every dollar stretched thinner, every silence heavier. The fridge hummed, the clock ticked, but I felt suspended, like life had moved on and forgotten to take me with it. I kept telling myself I had to stay strong for my son, but even that resolve began to crumble. He would look at me with those big, searching eyes, asking questions I couldn't answer. "When's Mom coming home? Why are we eating noodles again?" I'd smile, lie softly, and then hide in the bathroom afterward, staring at the man in the mirror. The hollowed eyes, the unshaven face, the sagging shoulders. He didn't look like a protector. He looked like a failure. The house felt colder, emptier each night. Friends stopped calling. Her family, once so vocal, disappeared completely, except for the occasional passive-aggressive text blaming me for tearing the family apart. I began to believe it. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I had pushed too hard, expected too much, tried to defend a son she never truly wanted to understand. At work, I functioned like a ghost. My manager's sympathetic glances only deepened my shame. Every paycheck went toward keeping the lights on, keeping my son in school, keeping the illusion that we were holding it together. But I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. I was spiraling quietly, too proud to ask for help, too afraid to face what asking would confirm. At night, I'd lie awake replaying the years before, the laughter, the shared dreams, the promises whispered in the dark. How had that woman become the stranger who looked at me with such disgust? How had love turned into a weapon? Each memory cut deeper, proof that maybe I'd been blind from the start. I found myself questioning everything, my judgment, my manhood, my worth as a father. I wondered if my son would grow up resenting me, thinking I hadn't done enough. The guilt gnawed at me, feeding off the loneliness until even breathing felt like work. Every morning I woke up feeling like I'd failed again simply for surviving another day. But beneath the despair, a quiet ember of anger began to stir. It wasn't loud or consuming, not yet, but it was there. A whisper that said I wasn't done. That maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over. I wasn't expecting anything to break the monotony of my despair. Not a call, not a message, not even a hint that the world still held surprises for me. And yet, one afternoon, a small envelope arrived, unassuming and slightly worn, addressed in handwriting I recognized immediately. Inside, folded neatly, was a napkin. I held it in my hands, confused at first, until I unfolded it and saw the faint, scrawled message that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't just a note. It was a clue, a lifeline, a whisper that someone out there still had my back. The words hinted at evidence, a secret that had been buried, a leverage point I could use to finally reclaim some control over the chaos my wife had created. My mind raced, replaying conversations, revisiting places, and re-examining interactions I'd once dismissed. Every memory now seemed to point to opportunities I'd overlooked, doors I could still open. The napkin was small, almost trivial, but it carried weight beyond its size. It symbolized hope, the possibility that my story wasn't finished, that justice might still be mine. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tight knot of despair in my chest loosen, replaced by a flicker of anticipation. I studied the note again, memorizing every word, every hint, knowing that this was the beginning of a plan, one that could turn the tide, one that could make her realize she had underestimated me. The quiet desperation that had defined my life for so long was now interspersed with something dangerous yet invigorating, the thrill of knowing I could fight back, and perhaps win. After I unfolded that napkin, something shifted from grief to calculation. I stopped feeling like a man caught in a storm and started feeling like someone holding a map. I made a list in my head: leverage, legal options, witnesses, receipts, messages, anything that could turn vague suspicion into undeniable proof. For the first time since she left, I began to plan rather than plead. I spent hours revisiting old conversations in my phone, scrolling through emails and piecing together patterns I'd ignored. There were small things I had dismissed as quirks before: the way she forwarded certain invoices to her sister, the odd transfers that showed up around holidays, the vague excuses about helping out relatives. On paper, these might have looked innocent. In context, they were breadcrumbs. I took screenshots, made copies, and wrote timelines. My internal monologue became a quiet, focused interrogation of every memory I'd once accepted at face value. I reached out to people I'd been too proud to involve before: neighbors, past coworkers, even the barista who always remembered my son's name. I learned who had noticed tensions, who had seen her leave late at night, who had heard thinly veiled custody threats. Little confirmations began to stack up. Each person I talked to gave me clarity, and with each the outline of a larger picture emerged. The napkin had been a trigger, but my persistence turned it into structure. Legal counsel was the next step. I called a lawyer with experience in family disputes and white-collar sleight of hand. The first consultation was clinical and draining. The lawyer asked for dates, proof, bank statements. I handed over the timelines and screenshots I'd compiled. He nodded at some entries, frowned at others, and said something that felt like oxygen. "There's enough here to start a probe." That phrase lodged itself in me. Enough to start, not guaranteed to finish, but enough. I also began to pull social proof. People's perceptions mattered: teachers, community members, mutual friends. If I wanted to dismantle the narrative she'd built, I needed voices on my side. So I documented kindnesses I'd shown our son, teachers who'd praised his progress, text messages that showed I'd been present and involved. I prepared to counter the performance she'd staged in public. This wasn't about revenge for showmanship. It was about reclaiming truth. There were quiet, tactical choices, too. I stopped posting about my life online and started using it as a record. I saved photos with timestamps, location tags, and notes about where we'd been. I ordered certified mail for important documents and kept receipts in a folder labeled with dates, small bureaucratic armor. The daily grind of collecting proof became oddly soothing. Each piece of paper, each saved message felt like a brick in a wall I was building to protect my son and myself. As I plotted, I balanced anger with caution. I knew going loud too soon would flip sympathy back to her. So many had already sided with her on instinct. I had to be smarter. My strategy relied on timing, not theatrics. I would assemble the evidence quietly, let the inconsistencies pile up, and then reveal them when they could not be dismissed. That was my first real taste of power, the control of when and how a story got told. In the evenings, when my son slept, I rehearsed conversations in my head, calmer versions of the man who had crumpled in the lobby. I imagined the lawyer's questions, the look on her family's faces when their convenient lies unraveled. Sometimes I allowed myself brief fantasies: her silence at a community meeting, a cold stare returned when she had to answer for what she'd done. Those fantasies grounded me, not as cruelty but as fuel. Power, I learned, could be patient, precise, and utterly decisive. I could see first small consequences forming, precise, inevitable, and soon to begin unfolding. By the time I closed the folder that night, I felt less like a victim and more like an architect. The napkin had started a chain, and I had begun to design its course. This was the first shift, subtle, methodical, dangerous, and it set the stage for the first strike I knew I would have to deliver. The first time I felt the shift in power, it was almost imperceptible, like the air had subtly changed around me. I started small, testing boundaries, seeing who noticed when I reclaimed control over parts of my life that had been stolen. At the bank, I corrected an error on a joint account she'd assumed she could manipulate without consequence. The teller raised an eyebrow, surprised at my assertiveness, and for the first time in months, I felt a spark of confidence. At school, I began quietly advocating for my son, ensuring his needs were met and that his achievements were recognized. A teacher commented on how involved I had been, as if noticing for the first time the care I had always given. My wife's absence suddenly seemed less like liberation for her and more like exposure for her actions. People began to glance at me differently, not with pity, but with recognition that I was no longer invisible. I also addressed financial discrepancies I had documented, making phone calls, sending letters, and correcting the record where she had tried to overshadow my contributions. Every small correction felt like a ripple through the calm surface of our fractured family, and I watched as the tension grew. She noticed, of course, subtle changes in my demeanor, the quiet confidence in my tone when I spoke with her relatives, the way I stopped flinching at her barbed comments. Conversations with neighbors and friends revealed whispers I had never heard before, questions asked behind her back, doubts creeping into the narrative she had controlled. Each acknowledgement, each nod of agreement, built momentum. I felt the first taste of leverage settle in my stomach, a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. By the end of the week, small victories had accumulated into a quiet storm. My son smiled more freely, sensing I was no longer defeated. The shift was subtle, yet undeniable. I had begun to reclaim my life piece by piece, and those who had underestimated me were starting to notice. The tension in the room, once solely directed at me, had begun to tip, and for the first time, I allowed myself a flicker of hope. It happened faster than I expected, the confrontation I had been both dreading and anticipating. My wife invited her sister and parents over under the guise of a family discussion, but I knew better. As soon as they arrived, the tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. I felt the familiar weight of judgment as they entered, their eyes scanning me as if I were already guilty of some unspeakable crime. She started immediately, raising her voice, recounting exaggerated versions of past disputes in front of everyone. Her words were sharp, meant to wound, and for a moment I felt that old, paralyzing embarrassment creeping back. But this time I didn't shrink. I breathed, steadying myself, and met her gaze with a calm that unnerved her. I began speaking, carefully and deliberately, recounting truths she had ignored, twisting her own narratives back onto her. I referenced dates, messages, and instances where her claims were false or exaggerated. My voice didn't waver, even as she shouted over me, her sister chiming in with defensive anger, her parents shaking their heads in disbelief. Each detail I revealed, each subtle proof, chipped away at the facade she had built. The room shifted. Where I had once been the timid, dismissed husband, I now stood as a composed, commanding presence. I saw their surprise, their discomfort, and felt the rush of power that came from finally being heard, finally taking control of the narrative. My son, standing beside me, looked up with wide eyes, sensing that this version of me was no longer vulnerable, no longer easily pushed aside. Her tirades began to falter as I exposed inconsistencies, contradictions, and outright lies. The whispers of neighbors who had overheard certain incidents, the evidence I had painstakingly gathered, and my unwavering demeanor combined into a force that left them visibly rattled. I could feel the social weight tipping. Their judgment no longer carried the authority it once did. By the end of the confrontation, what had been her stage of dominance became a showcase of her unraveling. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was reclaiming respect, asserting truth, and demonstrating that the person she had tried to diminish was not only intact, but stronger than ever. The contrast was clear. The weak, silenced figure of the past had become a formidable presence, a man who could no longer be dismissed or ignored. The battle lines were drawn, and the stakes had never felt higher. Just when I thought I had the upper hand, a new piece of information hit me like a thunderclap. I discovered that someone I had trusted implicitly, an old family friend I'd confided in for years, had been feeding my wife details about my movements, my conversations, even the evidence I had painstakingly gathered. Every plan I had crafted, every small victory I celebrated had been shadowed by betrayal. The realization left me reeling, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak twisting together into something sharp and consuming. As I dug deeper, the layers unraveled even more. Hidden accounts, unexplained transfers, and secret alliances within her family surfaced, all pointing to a coordinated effort to undermine me, to maintain control, and to keep me powerless. It wasn't just personal betrayal anymore. It was strategic, deliberate, and calculated. My mind raced, piecing together conversations I'd dismissed, noticing patterns that suddenly screamed with clarity. The suspense was suffocating. Each new discovery revealed that the people I believed to be allies were complicit, and every betrayal cut deeper than the last. I felt the familiar sting of rage and humiliation, but this time it fueled something darker, something methodical. I realized that to reclaim control, I would have to adjust, rethink, and strike with precision. The revelation changed everything. My carefully laid plans were no longer enough. I needed to account for hidden adversaries, anticipate unseen moves, and prepare for the final confrontation with more strategy and cunning than I had ever imagined. And yet, in the midst of shock and outrage, a strange clarity emerged. Betrayal could be used against them, and the more they had conspired, the greater their fall would be when the truth finally surfaced. The day everything shifted arrived quietly, yet it carried the weight of every sleepless night, every hidden tear, every calculated step I had taken. I walked into the courtroom with a calm I hadn't felt in months, carrying the evidence I had meticulously compiled, the bank statements, the messages, the receipts, the witness statements, and the correspondence hinted at by that small, cryptic napkin. My wife and her family sat across the room, their confident postures faltering the moment I stepped up to present my case. I could feel the shift in the air, a subtle tension that thickened as the judge reviewed my documents. As the proceedings unfolded, every misdeed she had tried to hide came to light. The financial manipulations, the favoritism masked as concern, the betrayals by those I had once trusted, they were all exposed under the harsh clarity of truth. Her face, once composed, began to flush with anger and disbelief, and her sister whispered urgently in her ear, but it was too late. The words, the proof, the weight of undeniable facts were like a hammer striking the fragile narrative she had built. When the verdict came down, it was swift and decisive. Custody arrangements were corrected, finances realigned, and public records reflected her deceit. The courtroom was silent for a moment, the tension palpable, until murmurs of astonishment began to ripple among those present. My wife's eyes met mine, a mixture of fury, shame, and resignation, and for the first time, I saw her stripped of the power she had wielded so effortlessly. Her parents looked on, their judgmental glares replaced with stunned recognition of the truth they had ignored for so long. I felt a strange surge of vindication, a cathartic release that washed over me like a storm breaking a long, suffocating drought. Every subtle humiliation I had endured, every quiet night of despair, all the isolation and planning, it culminated here, in this room, in the clarity of justice served. The social and emotional scales that had been so heavily tipped against me were finally balanced. And yet, it wasn't cruel triumph I felt. There was a quiet satisfaction, a deep breath of relief, a recognition that the battle had been fought not for vengeance alone, but for truth, for my son, and for the integrity I had almost lost in the process. As the proceedings ended and I left the courtroom, the weight of the past months lifted incrementally, replaced by a sense of empowerment I had not known in years. The world had watched the reckoning unfold, and in that exposure, the humiliation that had been mine for so long now rested squarely on those who had tried to diminish me. For my son, for myself, and for the life we were reclaiming. This was more than victory. It was proof that resilience, strategy, and patience could overturn even the most calculated betrayals, that the underestimated could rise, and that justice, however delayed, would eventually find its mark. The storm had passed, leaving clarity, vindication, and the quiet pride of a truth finally recognized. After the courtroom emptied and the murmurs faded, I found myself alone with my thoughts, the adrenaline slowly giving way to a deep, lingering exhaustion. The victory had been decisive, but the cost was not insignificant. Nights spent plotting, days filled with anxiety and meticulous planning, the emotional toll of reliving betrayals and deceptions. It all weighed heavily on me. I realized that while I had reclaimed power and justice, I had also carried anger and bitterness that could have consumed me if I hadn't been careful. Sitting quietly, I reflected on how far I had come. I saw the growth that had taken place in the shadows of suffering, patience, clarity, and a strategic mind honed by necessity. I had learned to hold my ground, to recognize truth amidst deception, and to act with both courage and precision. My son's presence beside me reminded me of why this battle had mattered, anchoring my reflections in love rather than vengeance alone. I acknowledged the resilience that had emerged from the pain. The man who had cowered in the school lobby, humiliated and invisible, now understood his own strength. The moral clarity I felt was profound. Justice could be pursued without cruelty. Boundaries could be enforced without losing empathy, and survival did not require sacrificing integrity. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that those who had tried to manipulate, belittle, and betray me had faced the consequences of their choices. But beyond that, there was peace in the realization that I had endured, learned, and emerged stronger, able to protect and nurture the life that truly mattered. The storm had passed, leaving not just victory, but understanding, wisdom, and the calm certainty that, despite the darkness, I had done what was right. In the days after the verdict, I focused on the most important part of my life, my son. The chaos, the betrayals, and the court battles had left scars on both of us, and I knew that rebuilding trust and closeness would take patience and care. I started with small gestures, helping him with homework, listening to his stories without distraction, and simply being present in ways I hadn't always managed before. Each shared laugh, each quiet conversation, felt like a tiny thread mending the frayed bond between us. One afternoon, as we sat together in the park, he climbed onto my lap and whispered, "I missed you, Dad." The simplicity of that admission struck me harder than any courtroom victory. I held him close, feeling the weight of lost time and the depth of the love that had endured despite everything. It wasn't about grand gestures or proving myself anymore. It was about showing up consistently, about being steady and reliable in a world that had felt unpredictable for too long. We started building new routines together, small rituals that created safe spaces for laughter, conversation, and mutual support. I let him choose our weekend activities, and I followed his lead, learning to value his perspective and reclaim the fatherhood I feared I had lost. Through these moments, I felt my own heart begin to heal, the anger and frustration softening into tenderness and understanding. By focusing on his happiness, I also discovered a renewed sense of purpose. I could see the boy I loved thriving, and I realized that our connection was stronger than the betrayals that had threatened to pull us apart. Every hug, every shared smile, every quiet evening together reaffirmed that we were not defined by the chaos around us, but by the bond we had nurtured and fought to protect. The journey to this point had been painful, but these moments of reconnection offered proof that love, patience, and consistency could heal even the deepest wounds. Just when I thought the storm had fully passed, a final twist arrived, quietly and unexpectedly. I unfolded the old napkin again, the one that had started it all, and discovered a note I had overlooked, a coded message that hinted at something hidden, a secret my wife had never anticipated me uncovering. It led me to a safe deposit box, tucked away in her family's name but accessible through careful legal maneuvering. Inside, I found documents revealing a small inheritance my son was entitled to, funds she had hoped would vanish unnoticed. The discovery was shocking, not because it changed our immediate lives, but because it confirmed the depth of deception she had relied upon. At the same time, an old ally, someone I had thought distant or neutral, came forward with corroborating evidence and heartfelt support, validating everything I had fought for. The revelation felt like the last piece of a puzzle, a quiet triumph that completed the arc of justice and strategy I had painstakingly built. It was subtle, almost private, yet profoundly satisfying. I smiled at my son, realizing that while we had faced betrayal and hardship, the future now held security, clarity, and lessons that would stay with us. The twist wasn't just about money or leverage, It was proof that persistence, vigilance, and integrity could uncover truths others thought hidden forever. Sitting alone that evening, after the dust of confrontation and revelation had settled, I allowed myself to reflect on everything that had transpired. The victories had been hard won, the betrayals sharp and unforgettable, but through it all, I had discovered reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. I realized that standing up for my son, for myself, and for truth had not just been about justice. It had been about reclaiming my identity and my dignity. I thought about the lessons etched into my memory, the importance of vigilance, the value of evidence, and the power of patience. I understood that resilience wasn't just enduring hardship. It was learning, adapting, and asserting one's worth despite adversity. Even in moments of anger or despair, I had found clarity, a moral compass that guided me through darkness. There was also a bittersweet undertone. The relationships I had once relied on, the illusions of trust and family unity, had been irreparably altered. I mourned what was lost even as I celebrated what had been reclaimed. My son's laughter, his growing confidence, and the quiet moments of connection reminded me why every painful step had been necessary. I felt empowered, not in a vengeful sense, but with the knowledge that I could protect, provide, and lead with integrity. The storm had changed us, but it had also strengthened us, forged a bond between father and son that was unshakable. And though echoes of betrayal would linger, they no longer controlled my life. The chapter had closed, leaving triumph intertwined with reflection, leaving me with a quiet certainty. I had survived. I had grown. And I had ensured that justice, love, and truth prevailed.